A very good day to you as we greet you on the fifth connection. If you have joined us live today, we welcome you as we continue our story in the book of Hebrews. The story unfolds across 13 chapters in which the writer is tracking through the profile of the superordinate Son, because our stick to itiveness is based upon who he is. He's the superordinate one in the first 4 verses of chapter 1. Then from verse 5 all the way through to chapter 10, verse number 18. He's the superordinate walk because of his worth and his work. And then finally in chapter 11 to 13, 11, 12, and 13, he's the superordinate way. It was in that movie, the Chinese war film of 2010, entitled Death and Glory in Changde. It was based upon the events of that battle in 1943. It was the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the title of the movie suggests a bloodbath of a city that was isolated. The purpose of the Japanese offensive was to maintain pressure on the Chinese National Revolutionary Army in order to reduce their capability, their threat, their combat ability in the region. But the Japanese were eventually held at bay, and they were forced at the city of Changde by a group of civilians to evacuate because they got pinned down and eventually had to leave the region. I've entitled this slice of the story, verse 5 to verse 9, Death and Glory. Death and glory. Because it is through the humiliation of the Son, his death, that his glory would rise. His rulership over all things was effected. So it really comes through death and glory, his humiliation and his exaltation, his glorification over all things. And this paragraph raises the question, how is the life of this Son the fractal for human experience? How is the life of this Son the fractal pattern for human experience, and not angels incidentally, but human experience? Because you see, the writer is demonstrating how that this Son is greater than angels, and he starts that discussion in verse number 5 of chapter 1. And he's tracking through, unfolding line by line, who the Son is, how he operates in his world. So let's see how the writer answers that question. How is the life of the Son the fractal pattern? And when we talk about a fractal pattern, we talk about order, disorder, and reorder. Put another way, we are talking about the death and resurrection cycle, the pattern of resurrection in the life of a believer and in the lives of these Hebrew believers. They were converts to Christianity, but they were standing in great danger of defecting because of persecution. And so the writer demonstrates his argument in two specific ideas, or through two ideas. The one is in verse 5. Watch what verse 5 says. Chapter 2, verse 5. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It is not to angels. Angels were not the focus. Angels are the messenger boys. The word angelos means messenger. And so they are the supreme spirit beings that are at God's beck and call, and they serve him. So it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Because you need to understand that reordered living is not the domain of the angels. They are not in view. God has a set order, but when that order is upset because of foolish decisions we make, unwise choices we make, our lives have to reset. So it's set, upset, and then reset. Or order, disorder, and reorder. The short form will be death and resurrection. I need to die to my own ambitions, my small ambitions, and rise to live for God. Now, these angels are the sons of God in verse 5, because in Deuteronomy 32 and verse number 8, we have a reference to the Most High, God giving over the nations, their inheritance, to these supreme beings, over whom these divine beings would rule. When he divided mankind, when did God divide mankind? Genesis chapter 11. He divided mankind and he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. That's what 32 verse 8 says. Now, some translations, some versions read, he fixes the borders and the peoples according to the number of the tribes of Israel. The problem with that reading is Israel did not exist in Genesis 11 when God divided the nations. And so the more accurate reading is God dividing the nations and fixing their borders according to the numbers of the sons of God. Right? The sons of God are in view because they rule over these geographic locations. But they mess up, as Psalm 82 would tell us, and Psalm 89 together give us more and more information about what happened in Deuteronomy 32 and further back in Genesis 11. And so we have come to displace these messenger boys, if you will, these spirit beings, because we're going to be judging them. We will judge angels according to 1 Corinthians 6. Because Psalm 8 verse 6 says, God has made him, this Son of God, a little lower than the angels. So there's no salvation for angels, and that comes up in 2:5, because what God does not have angels in view. It has the believers in view, humankind, and then more specifically, believers. Chapter 2, verse number 16 adds to that idea. And so reordered living is not the domain of angels. The second idea comes up in verse 6 to verse 9, that disorder precedes the reordering of life. Disorder precedes reordered living. That reordered living comes through death and through rule. Disorder may seem purposeless, but watch what verse 6 and verse 7a says. Verse 6 says, it has been testified somewhere. What has been testified somewhere? What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. Jesus was made for a little while lower than the angels. And this word for lower is the word that comes up in John chapter 3 and verse number 30. Ye must increase, but I must decrease. The word decrease, made lower. Jesus is made lower than the angels for a little while. Why? So that he could be crowned with glory and honor and everything put under subjection under his feet. So God was very purposeful in sending this Son. The Son took on humanity, died, but rose again with power, according to Romans chapter 1, to be crowned with glory and honor and to see his enemies in subjection to him. Verse 8 goes on to say, now in putting everything in subjection to him, God left nothing outside his control. That is the antecedent of he. He left nothing outside his control. That's what God did. And at the present time, we do not yet see anything in subjection to him. Who is we? Hebrew believers, Christian Hebrews, those who had converted to Christianity. The word Christianity appears twice in the New Testament scriptures. Once in the book of Acts and once in the letters of Peter. But the more common way that Christianity is described is as the way. Doesn't that sound familiar? The Christian way. Jesus is the way. John 14, verse number 6. He is the true and living way. So we are followers of the way. We're not Baptists or Methodist or Episcopalian or, as someone has said, Episcobapterian, a whole mixture of the above. We are Bible believers. We are people who are blood bought. And so the text goes on to say, but we see him, that is Christ, these believers, Hebrew believers, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. Now the writer identifies or IDs this Son, which comes up in verse number 1 and verse number 2 of chapter 1. He is a Son. But the writer has been working up toward a climax here, and now he mentions the name Yeshua, HaMashiach, Jesus Messiah, because Jesus is King. Messiah is King. He's the anointed one. He's made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, and he's the one who's crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death. He lives, but he dies on a cross so that by the grace of God, he might taste death. For whom? For everyone. And everyone here means everyone. Verse 10. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their faith perfect through suffering. That's verse 10. And we will pick up that verse in our next slice of the story. But you see how that death is the turning point. But resurrection gives the finality. He's not a dead savior. He's a risen savior. Romans 4, verse number 25 says, he died for our justification. But Romans 5, verse 9 talks about he was raised for our justification. Two irreducible minimum components, death and resurrection. And both have to do with justification. The one cannot go without the other. So to say that his death saves is incomplete. You only have one component. You need to have both. He dies, but he rises. Two components as the irreducible minimum for that which is able to save. The saving work of Christ. And so we see this fractal pattern, the fractal pattern of death and resurrection. This pattern of life, disorder and reorder, or order, disorder and reorder. Set, reset, set, upset and reset. Now, even pagans know something of that. Even business people know something of that, that business goes through these slumps. Very orderly run business, and sometimes somehow it's a hiccup for whatever reason. And there has to be a regrouping and a reset, a reboot almost. Our lives go through that more than we would ever want to admit. Sometimes very orderly, but there are elements that crash in, that cause great disorder and consternation. And it's during those times that we need the ministry and work of the Spirit of God. Well, that is how the writer answers the question. And what's the question in this section of the text? How is the life of this son the fractal pattern for human experience? If you want to go deep and grow deep with God, you are going to experience that fractal pattern. John chapter 12, round about verse 26 says, if a grain of wheat, except a grain of wheat, fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But when it dies, it will bring forth much fruit. It will produce. A seed knows that somehow. Somehow we are so hard of learning, we don't understand that it's through those challenging times in our lives that the greater growth happens. The growth spurts happen. If you are reaching for the bench and you're sliding for home and going to stagnation mode, you're going to feel the pain of not moving along. The writer throughout the book of Hebrews says, stick-to-itiveness is worth it all. Hold on to him. Persevere in the faith, and you're going to see how he's going to employ that idea, because there's one thing that puts us in great danger of falling away. One thing and one alone. And you will have to listen for the next exciting episodes as they rise, as we speak through the biblical text of Hebrews. I trust that you would have a good rest of the day. May God bless you. Thanks for joining us.